In this city, everything had a price. Bodies, time, silence, even the illusion of choice. She survived by selling what the world demanded and keeping the rest locked inside. Every night was a transaction, every touch a contract, every smile a controlled expense. She did not dream of escape. She calculated it, one night at a time. Then he appeared. He did not want her body. He did not want her night. He did not want what men usually bought. He wanted her presence. Not as intimacy, not as pleasure, as possession without touch, as control without contact, as proof that even a human being could be reduced to a line in a ledger. In a world where everything could be bought, he was testing the only question that still mattered. Was there anything money could not claim? And she, who owned nothing but herself, became the experiment. From that moment, this was no longer a transaction. It was a collision between power and survival. Between a man who believed in price and a woman who had learned the cost of being owned. The city revealed itself through glare and moisture, a lattice of neon stitched into wet pavement. Casino towers burned like open vaults against the desert night, glass and steel rising as monuments to appetite. Light spilled across asphalt, turning streets into mirrors of commerce. Music leaked from doorways, mixing with exhaust, perfume, and alcohol. Everything reflected everything else. Faces in windows, bodies in chrome, desire in advertisements. The night did not seduce. It calculated. She moved through it with controlled precision. Every step carried intention, every glance contained a decision. Her posture was practiced, neither inviting nor closed, calibrated to draw attention without surrendering to it. Clothing concealed what had once been examined too closely by strangers, bruises hidden beneath fabric chosen for function rather than fantasy. Her expression never asked for anything. It measured, it evaluated, it survived. This was not a world of accidents. Here, intimacy was engineered, time was negotiated, even emotion was managed like a risk factor. She lived inside a structure of rapid exchanges and temporary identities where closeness was contractual and vulnerability was a liability. People paid not for connection but for the sensation of it. She sold what others pretended to give freely: presence, focus, proximity. She did not call it survival, but that was what it was. Efficient, repeatable, necessary. She did not see herself as a victim, because victims were still waiting for rescue. She had stopped waiting long ago, but neither did she confuse endurance with freedom. She understood the arithmetic of her own existence. Her body and her hours were the only assets she possessed, and every night she decided how to allocate them in order to remain in motion. Freedom, in this city, was expensive. She did not yet have enough to purchase it. The streets pulsed with movement. Groups passed in bursts of laughter and intoxication. Couples negotiated in quiet shadows. Men in tailored jackets spoke into phones, their voices sharp with authority, moving money that never touched their hands. Advertisements promised transformation in careless color, luck, beauty, reinvention. She had never believed in any of it. Money could move a person through space, but it could not rewrite what had already been carved into them by hunger, loss, and necessity. She had learned to keep her past in fragments. No full stories, no open histories. In this economy, narrative was a form of packaging, and she refused to be wrapped in anything that could be owned. Each interaction remained deliberately unfinished. Every agreement carried its ending within it. He entered this system without ceremony. There was no entourage, no spectacle meant to announce importance. He did not move like someone seeking entertainment. He moved as if the environment had already been mapped, categorized, understood. Age separated him from the men who usually approached her, but not simply by years. There was a density to him, a sense that time did not pass through him easily but was instead absorbed, stored, controlled. His presence altered the rhythm of the space around him without demanding attention. He was not there to consume. The city did not excite him. He regarded it as an operating system, a network of incentives and outcomes that could be predicted and adjusted. His life existed in strata most people never touched, where decisions were not about individuals but about flows of capital, market behavior, and leverage. Money was not indulgence to him. It was language. It opened doors before he reached them. It rearranged futures with a signature. When he noticed her, it was not the way others did. His eyes did not linger where they were expected to. They assessed, measured, calculated. He did not register her as spectacle. He recognized in her the precision of someone who understood value without illusion. Someone who did not pretend this world was anything other than transactional. That recognition unsettled him. He had built his life on the assumption that everything could be priced, that any variable could be reduced to cost, that any resistance could be overcome with sufficient resources. Yet beneath that mastery existed a suspicion he had never allowed himself to examine, that somewhere in the machinery he controlled, something remained that could not be quantified. He had not expected to encounter that question here, in a city engineered entirely around exchange. Their first interaction did not follow the familiar script. He did not approach her as a client seeking escape, nor did he perform the rituals of charm or dominance common in this environment. What he offered was stripped of ornament, not a night, not a physical arrangement, an agreement about presence, time without touch, attention without consumption, to remain with him in space without the usual terms. The proposal disrupted the economy she knew. In her world, time was sold only as it was attached to the body. Being asked simply to exist beside someone without performing the role she had perfected felt almost hostile. It challenged the logic that had kept her alive. Nothing in this city was free. Nothing was given without expectation. She studied him the way she studied all risk. The money was more than adequate, but what disturbed her was not the number. It was the absence of a visible demand. There was no immediate extraction, no defined outcome. In a system built on exchange, an undefined transaction was the most dangerous thing of all. He observed her hesitation without impatience. To him, this was not seduction. It was inquiry. He had spent his life within structures that insisted everything could be measured, that any resistance could be translated into cost. Now he wanted to see where that principle failed. He wanted to locate the boundary of his own power. She accepted. Not out of trust, and not out of belief in some hidden promise. She accepted because refusal would have meant retreating into the pattern she already knew. And something in the way he had asked suggested this was not another variation of the same exchange. It was a deviation, a fracture. They moved through the city together, not as client and provider, not as lovers, but as two individuals occupying the same space without a defined hierarchy. For her, the lack of immediate demand was more disorienting than any overt threat. She was accustomed to translating every gesture into obligation. Here, the equation remained unfinished. For him, her presence was not comfort. It was evidence. He noted the way she scanned exits, the way her posture never fully released, the way attention was returned not with flirtation, but with calculation. He did not interpret vulnerability as something to exploit. He read it as the visible result of a system functioning exactly as designed, extracting from those with less until survival itself became a commodity. The night continued its commerce around them. Glass clinked, music rose and fell. Screens promised reinvention at the price of a swipe. Bodies were bought. Illusions were sold in high definition. Yet in the midst of that relentless market, something intangible entered the exchange. Not desire, not trust, a question. She began to feel the edges of her own role blur. Without the familiar structure of transaction, she was forced to confront something she had long avoided, who she was when she was not being purchased. It was not a comforting question. It was destabilizing. Identity, she had learned, was safest when it was temporary. He, in turn, found that proximity without ownership unsettled him more than resistance ever had. His life had been built on control of systems, not of individuals. Yet even within those systems, there had always been a mechanism to enforce outcome. Here, there was none. Her presence was not something he could secure with contracts or capital. It simply existed, unclaimed. The city whispered its doctrine in every reflection. Everything has a price. He had constructed an empire on that belief. She had survived by it. Neither of them yet understood what it would mean if that belief proved incomplete. Their meeting did not announce itself as destiny. There was no spectacle, no elevation of the moment. It registered instead as pressure, like the first fault in a structure that had seemed permanent. The kind of fracture that did not collapse immediately, but altered how weight was distributed, altered what could be supported. She did not leave with certainty. He did not leave with less power, but something fundamental had shifted. A line had been crossed that could not be undone, not through intimacy, but through recognition. In a city where existence was measured, bought, and sold, two people had entered into an agreement that did not resolve into consumption. Not yet. And in that unresolved space, something dangerous had begun. Not romance. Not salvation. The possibility that there were limits to what money could claim. In a world built on the opposite assumption, that possibility was the most volatile currency of all. She did not leave the night behind when the first exchange ended. The city followed her into the morning like a residue that refused to wash off. Light replaced neon, but the geometry of power remained unchanged. Glass towers still reflected control. Streets still arranged themselves around profit. The only difference was visibility. In daylight, the mechanisms were easier to see. He did not vanish after that first disruption. He did not retreat into the distance that usually separated men like him from women like her. Instead, his presence became a recurring variable in her calculations. It did not intrude, did not announce itself, but it remained close enough to be felt. She understood instinctively that this was not coincidence. For him, proximity was a form of observation. Their dynamic did not resemble pursuit. There were no gestures meant to impress, no overt attempts at dominance. What he offered was something far more destabilizing: access. Not indulgence, but passage. Doors opened in front of her that had never existed before. Transportation without constraint. Spaces that did not require negotiation. Rooms where the usual rituals of permission and performance were unnecessary. For her, it felt like stepping into a parallel version of the same world, one where gravity obeyed different laws. She had always understood that money created options, but she had never experienced the scale at which it erased limits entirely. Movement became frictionless. Time stopped being something she sold by the hour and became something that could be spent without accounting. The city rearranged itself around them, not through magic, but through the simple application of resources. Reservations appeared where there had been waiting lists. Security yielded without explanation. Boundaries dissolved quietly. What unsettled her was not the luxury itself. She had been near wealth before, had touched its edges in brief transactions. What unsettled her was the absence of resistance. No bargaining, no justification, no requirement to prove worthiness. The world simply complied. She understood immediately how dangerous that was. For him, wealth had never been something to be enjoyed in isolation. It was a tool, a system of influence that allowed reality to be edited. He did not offer her these experiences as gifts. He presented them as data. He watched how she moved through spaces where her past held no authority, how her posture shifted when she did not have to anticipate being priced, how her attention recalibrated when the usual constraints of survival were temporarily removed. He was not testing her desire. He was testing her limits. Each new possibility he placed in front of her carried the same unspoken question. How far could she go if the fear of tomorrow were eliminated? If rent, food, safety, and exit routes were no longer variables she had to solve for? If survival were no longer the governing principle of her decisions, what would remain of her? She recognized the structure of what he was doing even as she allowed herself to move within it. His offers were not benevolent. They were controlled environments. Experiments in which he removed one pressure at a time to see what emerged in its absence. He was studying not only her reactions, but the underlying architecture of a person shaped by scarcity. At the same time, she was conducting her own assessment. She did not mistake his calm for kindness. She saw in him a discipline that had been refined by systems far larger than any individual. He did not act out of impulse. Every choice was aligned with an internal logic that valued outcomes over sentiment. Yet beneath that structure, she began to sense something else. An emptiness that was not dramatic, not wounded, but absolute. A vacuum created by a life in which nothing resisted. He had never needed to want. Everything had always been obtainable. Obstacles had been temporary, challenges procedural. Even loss, when it occurred, could be managed through replacement. There was no scarcity in his world, only delay. For her, scarcity had been the defining force of existence. It had shaped her instincts, her boundaries, her identity. She had learned to make decisions based on what could be endured, not what could be chosen. Desire had always been secondary to necessity. Safety had been conditional. Every opportunity had carried the risk of dependency. Now she was standing inside a space where dependency was being offered without coercion. The game between them intensified not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Each day introduced a new dimension of possibility, places she had only seen in passing, environments where people spoke not in cash, but in influence, situations where outcomes were not negotiated, but assumed. He did not push her forward. He simply removed the barriers and observed what she did with the opening. She began to feel the psychological strain of it. For the first time, her decisions were no longer dictated by immediate survival. The familiar urgency that had governed her life receded, leaving behind a void where choice was supposed to be. She discovered that freedom, when it appeared without preparation, was not liberating. It was disorienting. Without the structure of necessity, she was forced to confront the deeper question of what she actually wanted, separate from what she had been conditioned to accept. That question did not come easily. She found herself hesitating in ways she never had before, pausing not because of fear, but because of uncertainty. In the absence of transactional frameworks, she had to define her own terms. She had to decide what was acceptable not based on cost, but on meaning. And meaning was a language she had not spoken in years. He noticed the shift. He observed the moments where she slowed, where her attention turned inward rather than outward. He registered the tension between the instinct to seize opportunity and the equally powerful instinct to remain self-contained. What fascinated him was not her compliance, but her resistance to becoming absorbed by what he offered. She did not rush to claim what was suddenly available. She treated each new freedom as both gift and threat. It was precisely this caution that drew him further. He had spent his life among people who adapted instantly to advantage, who consumed opportunity without reflection. In her, he saw something fundamentally different. She did not confuse access with ownership. She did not assume that what was possible was therefore permissible. Her restraint was not moral in the conventional sense, it was existential. A refusal to dissolve herself into a system that, however seductive, still operated on the same principles that had once reduced her to an asset. The power dynamic between them remained unresolved. He controlled the environment. He controlled the conditions. But he did not control her internal economy. That distinction mattered to him more than any overt display of authority ever could. For her, the danger was becoming increasingly difficult to define. Dependence did not announce itself with chains. It arrived as convenience, as relief, as the gradual softening of vigilance. Each moment she spent in a world where tomorrow was no longer a threat made it harder to return to the one she had come from. The contrast sharpened into something painful. She began to understand that this was not merely exposure to luxury. It was exposure to an alternate reality in which the rules that had governed her existence simply did not apply. And that reality was being mediated entirely through him. She did not want to belong to him. She did not want to owe him. Yet she could not deny that every door he opened brought her further from the life she had known. The longer she remained in his orbit, the more fragile her independence became. Not because he demanded anything, but because he did not. The absence of pressure was its own form of influence. She began to see that his experiment was not only about her. It was also about himself. Through her, he was testing the validity of the world he had inherited. He was watching what happened when the tools of absolute control were applied not to markets or institutions, but to a human life shaped by deprivation. He wanted to know whether money could not only purchase access, but alter identity. At the same time, something in her presence was destabilizing his internal order. He had always understood people in terms of function, networks of incentives, hierarchies of leverage, but she did not behave as an asset optimized for extraction. She resisted being defined by utility. Even as she accepted what he offered, she remained distinct from it. Her sense of self did not dissolve into gratitude or ambition. It remained stubbornly separate. This separation disturbed him more than opposition ever had. He began to feel in her presence the first genuine uncertainty he had experienced in years. Not about outcomes, but about meaning. The systems he commanded could generate wealth, movement, and compliance, but they could not generate authenticity. What she carried within her, shaped by hardship and endurance, could not be reproduced by capital. It existed outside his reach, and that fact both fascinated and unsettled him. Their interactions became increasingly charged, with unspoken recognition. She saw in him the embodiment of a world that had never had to account for consequence in human terms. A world where decisions were abstract, insulated from the lives they reshaped. Yet she also saw the cost of that insulation. A man who had never been forced to confront limitation had never been forced to confront himself. He saw in her a form of integrity that did not rely on ideology or principle. It was the integrity of someone who had learned, through necessity, where their boundaries lay. She did not perform resistance. She inhabited it. The game between them was no longer about what could be offered or accepted. It had become a silent contest of influence. Not who could dominate, but whose worldview would remain intact. For her, the stakes were existential. If she allowed herself to be fully absorbed into his world, she risked losing the very self that had allowed her to survive it. If she rejected it entirely, she would return to a life where survival consumed all other possibilities. There was no neutral position. For him, the stakes were philosophical. If he could not reduce her to a function within his system, then his belief in the totality of control was incomplete. And if his belief was incomplete, then the empire he had inherited was built on an illusion. Neither of them spoke these truths. They did not need to. Every shared space, every frictionless movement through a world designed to accommodate him, reinforced the tension between them. She walked carefully, not because she feared him, but because she feared the erosion of herself. He watched intently, not because he desired her in any conventional sense, but because she represented the first variable he could not solve. What had begun as an anomalous transaction had become a psychological terrain. A game not of seduction, but of survival. For her, survival no longer meant simply enduring the next day. It meant preserving identity in the face of overwhelming possibility. For him, survival meant something he had never had to consider before, the survival of a worldview confronted by its own limits. Neither of them yet understood how costly that confrontation would become. But they both knew that whatever this was, it was no longer a simple exchange. It was an experiment with no defined outcome. And in a world where outcomes were usually guaranteed by power, That uncertainty was the most dangerous element of all. The neutrality between them did not collapse in a single moment. It eroded. What had begun as controlled proximity and measured observation gradually transformed into something neither of them could classify within the structures they understood. The spaces they shared were no longer simply environments in which power could be demonstrated or resisted. They became sites of confrontation. Not external, not dramatic, but internal, where the assumptions each of them carried about the world were forced into direct contact. For her, the change was first felt as pressure behind the ribs. A tightening whenever his gaze lingered too long, whenever his silence extended beyond calculation and into something more attentive. She had lived her life surrounded by attention, but never by this kind. His focus did not demand performance. It did not require display. It sought understanding. And that made her dangerous to herself. She had always treated her past as inventory she kept in sealed compartments. Experiences were resources only insofar as they informed survival. Loss was something to be endured privately. Poverty something to be outpaced. The violence of systems and people something to be navigated, not articulated. But in his presence, something shifted. Not because he asked, but because for the first time she sensed that what she carried inside her could not be immediately converted into currency. She began, slowly, to let pieces of herself surface. Not in confession, not in dramatization. In fragments. In references that did not demand sympathy but insisted on being acknowledged. The years spent measuring every decision against rent and safety. The instability of homes that were never truly hers. The moments when authority had not protected but punished, when rules had been enforced selectively, when survival had meant accepting conditions that stripped away dignity without leaving marks that could be proven. She did not frame herself as broken. She framed herself as shaped. He listened without interruption. He did not respond with reassurance or moral outrage. He did not attempt to translate her experience into solutions. What unsettled him was not the content of what she revealed, but the fact that it could not be integrated into the system he understood. There was no metric for it. No way to quantify the cost of a childhood spent negotiating instability, or the residue left by living in constant awareness of being expendable. For the first time, his internal architecture encountered something it could not model. He, in turn, began to expose the foundations of his own reality. He did not speak of emotions. He spoke of structure, of a world in which value was determined by movement of capital, where morality was an extension of market logic rather than a constraint upon it. He articulated the belief that outcomes were the only truths that mattered, that intention was irrelevant if results could be optimized. In his world, suffering was not denied, but it was abstracted. It became data, collateral, an externality absorbed by the system in the pursuit of efficiency. He had learned to function within this framework not because he lacked conscience, but because conscience had never been operational within the environment that raised him. The rules he lived by were not cruel in his view. They were simply real. To him, money was not corruption. It was clarity. She absorbed this with a kind of quiet intensity. She did not counter him with ideology. She did not accuse him of inhumanity. She did not attempt to dismantle his logic. Instead, she held her own experience against it, and in that juxtaposition, something fractured. She recognized that in his world, what had defined her life was not tragedy. It was inefficiency, a failure of distribution, a byproduct. That recognition did not ignite anger. It ignited something colder. For her, money had always been a tool, a means to continue existing. It had never been the point. It had never promised meaning. It had promised only margin, safety for a moment, distance from the worst possibilities. But meaning, when it appeared in her life, had never come from accumulation. It had come from endurance, from refusing to disappear even when the world seemed structured to erase her. For him, money was not simply a tool. It was the only reality he trusted. It was how power manifested, how order was maintained, how chaos was prevented from overwhelming systems. He had learned to equate control with stability and stability with truth. Anything that could not be measured could not be managed. Anything that could not be managed could not be allowed to determine outcomes. Between these two positions, there was no compromise. The tension between them did not explode. It thickened. It occupied the spaces between words, the moments where both of them paused, recognizing that they were no longer engaged in a shared experiment. They were engaged in a confrontation between two incompatible definitions of what it meant to exist. He began to see her not as a variable to be tested, but as a direct challenge to the coherence of his worldview. Her presence resisted reduction. Her history could not be abstracted without violence to its meaning. The fact that she could articulate survival without reverence for capital destabilized the logic he had treated as absolute. She began to see him not simply as the embodiment of power, but as a man whose identity was inextricably bound to the systems he commanded. His certainty was not arrogance. It was necessity. Without the belief that his world was the only real one, he would be forced to confront the possibility that his life had been constructed around a fiction. The dynamic between them crossed a line that neither of them had anticipated. She was no longer merely existing in his orbit. She was redefining the space it occupied, and he was no longer simply observing her resistance. He was experiencing it as a threat. Not a threat to his safety, a threat to his internal order. He could no longer categorize her as a function. She had become something he could not own, not because she refused, but because ownership itself proved insufficient to encompass what she represented. Her presence disrupted his sense of inevitability. It introduced the possibility that power, even at its most absolute, could encounter something it could not absorb. For her, the realization was equally destabilizing. She had spent her life guarding herself against being claimed, against being reduced to what others needed or wanted. Now she stood in proximity to a man whose power was so vast that resistance itself felt abstract. Yet in his presence, for the first time, she experienced something she had never known in any transaction, the sensation that she was not being consumed. Her value in that space was not tied to what she provided. It was tied to what she was. That recognition terrified her more than any overt danger ever had. To be valued for existence rather than utility meant that if she were to step away, it would not be because the contract had ended. It would be because she had chosen to leave. And choice, real choice, carried responsibility she had never been allowed to shoulder before. The point of no return did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, in the moment both of them understood that what was unfolding between them could not be undone by reverting to terms. There was no longer a contract to dissolve, no framework to retreat into. What remained was a mutual recognition that their proximity had altered the internal structure of both their lives. He could not return to a worldview in which everything could be priced. She could not return to a life in which she was only what others were willing to buy. They had crossed an internal boundary. Not into romance, not into devotion. Into a space where every further step would be taken not out of necessity or calculation, but out of deliberate alignment with a truth that endangered them both. For him, continuing meant acknowledging that the systems he commanded were not morally neutral, that they were built on abstractions that erased the lived reality of people like her. To accept her fully was to admit that his empire, however efficient, was incomplete. For her, continuing meant risking the one thing she had never been able to afford to lose, the autonomy forged through hardship. To remain in his orbit was to accept that her identity would be shaped, inevitably, by a power that dwarfed her own. The gravity between them was no longer theoretical. It was personal. Neither of them spoke of love. Neither of them sought comfort in illusion. What they faced was more severe than emotion, a decision about what kind of world they were willing to inhabit. The city outside continued to operate as it always had. Capital flowed. Hierarchies remained intact. The machinery of exchange did not pause for individual crises, but within the private geometry of their shared space, something irreversible had occurred. They had seen each other clearly. Not as roles, not as assets, as contradictions made human. And in that recognition, the game that had begun as an experiment ended. What remained was choice, and the knowledge that whatever they chose next would not preserve them. It would redefine them. The illusion did not shatter all at once. It thinned. What she had first experienced as an expansion of possibility began to reveal its architecture. The access he granted her was not accidental, not merely the result of wealth loosely applied. It was structured, directed, supported by networks that extended far beyond the visible surface of the city. The doors that opened before them were not isolated conveniences. They were nodes in a system designed to redirect outcomes on a scale she had never been forced to confront. The scope of his influence emerged gradually, through fragments she could no longer ignore. Private terminals that bypassed commercial transit, meetings that took place in spaces unmarked by signage or jurisdiction, names spoken in passing that carried consequences across industries, financial movements that reshaped neighborhoods without ever appearing in public records. She began to understand that what she had interpreted as personal power was in fact institutional. His wealth was not a reservoir, it was a current. He did not boast about it. He did not dramatize his position. That, in itself, was part of what made it terrifying. Power this comprehensive did not need to announce itself. It operated quietly, invisibly, adjusting the environment so that resistance appeared irrational or futile. She started to recognize patterns she had lived under her entire life. Communities erased in the name of development, housing converted into speculation, labor reduced to variable cost, decisions made far from the streets they would ultimately transform. What she had once understood only as misfortune now revealed itself as design. The instability that had shaped her past was not random. It was produced. And he stood at the center of that production. The realization did not arrive as outrage. It arrived as grief. Not for what she had lost, but for what she had never been allowed to imagine. Safety had always seemed fragile, provisional. Now she saw that it had been allocated. Her childhood, her sense of future, even the violence that had driven her into a life defined by exchange had been downstream of choices made in boardrooms and trading floors. The system that had forced her to monetize herself was the same system that had built his world. Her proximity to him transformed that abstraction into something personal. She could no longer separate the man from the machinery he embodied. His presence carried with it the weight of structures that had consumed entire populations without ever encountering accountability. The intimacy that had begun to grow between them became charged with an unbearable contradiction. The one person who had made her feel uncommodified was also a primary agent of the system that had commodified her life. For him, the exposure of his world did not register as confession. It was simply reality. He had never believed in innocence where capital was concerned. Markets did not create suffering in his view. They revealed it, redistributed it, optimized it. He understood that every empire was built on displacement. He did not deny that his industries reshaped cities, redefined labor, extracted resources. To him, these were not moral failures. They were mechanisms. What unsettled him was not her reaction to this knowledge. It was the way it changed the air between them. Where she had once moved with cautious fascination through his spaces, she now carried a tension that did not dissipate with comfort. Her silence was no longer neutral. It was judgment, though not in the sense of accusation. It was a deeper refusal, a refusal to accept that this was simply how the world had to function. For her, money had always been survival, but it had never been meaning. Now she was confronted with a reality in which money was not only survival, but architecture. the invisible hand that had shaped the limits of her existence. To remain close to him meant inhabiting a world that depended on the continued operation of forces that had erased entire versions of herself before she had ever been allowed to choose who she might become. Their closeness transformed into conflict without words. She began to pull away in ways that were not physical. Her attention sharpened. Her questions became more precise. She no longer accepted his environment as given. She examined it, mapped it, recognized in its design the same logic that had reduced human lives to numbers in ledgers. He, in turn, found himself confronting a resistance he could not neutralize. It was not political. It was existential. She did not demand that he renounce his power or abandon his empire. She did not frame her discomfort as ideology. Instead, she held her own history against the reality of his wealth, and in that juxtaposition, his system appeared incomplete. Not wrong by its own logic, but incompatible with something essential in her. He could not return to a belief in pure efficiency once he saw what it had required of her. Yet he also could not retreat into a fantasy of moral cleanliness. He knew too much about the structures he commanded to pretend they could be dismantled without collapse. To abandon them would not liberate the world. It would simply create a vacuum into which something worse would flow. He had built his identity around managing that machinery precisely because it was brutal, because he believed it was better to hold the reins than to leave them to chaos. Between them, the tension intensified into something unsustainable. Externally, the pressure began to manifest. Their connection, once contained within controlled spaces, started to register within the larger social field. The environments they occupied did not remain private. Security teams adjusted protocols. Advisors altered schedules. Names were circulated in circles where reputation functioned as currency. She was no longer invisible within his world. She was noticed. And with notice came classification. She was not seen as a person. She was read as a variable, an asset, a liability, a weakness. Those who operated around him interpreted her presence through the only framework they recognized: value. What did she represent? What could be leveraged through her? What risk did she introduce? The media did not yet know her name, but it sensed a deviation. Whispers surfaced in financial columns, in the coded language of analysts and industry insiders. Observers noted shifts in his patterns, subtle deviations from the cold discipline that had defined his public image. He was described as distracted, uncharacteristically opaque. Rumors began to circulate that personal involvement had begun to interfere with strategic clarity. In this ecosystem, vulnerability was not tragic. It was exploitable. For her, the experience was familiar in a different register. She had lived in a world where visibility always carried cost, where being noticed meant being evaluated, assigned worth, sorted into hierarchies. Now that logic reasserted itself in a more sophisticated form. She was no longer assessed by individuals. She was assessed by systems. She recognized the gaze immediately. It was the same one she had encountered in institutions, in enforcement, in the invisible bureaucracy that had shaped her past. The gaze that did not see people, only functions. Her proximity to him had not liberated her from commodification. It had elevated it. The realization was devastating. She had believed, briefly, that with him she could exist outside the marketplace that had consumed her life. That his attention represented a space where she was not reduced to what could be extracted. Now she saw that in his world, extraction was simply more abstract. Her identity was being translated into risk assessments, strategic calculations, reputation management. Love in this context was not shelter, it was exposure. For him, the response from his environment forced a confrontation he had never anticipated. He had been willing to accept internal upheaval. He had been prepared to reevaluate his own certainties. What he had not fully accounted for was the systemic reaction to deviation. His empire did not tolerate irregularity. It did not accommodate human unpredictability. The networks that sustained his power were designed to correct aberrations before they destabilize the structure. Her presence was now being treated as such an aberration. He began to see how quickly the machinery he controlled could turn against what he valued. Not through violence, through narrative, through the subtle erosion of credibility, through the reclassification of her as an influence that compromised judgment. He understood that if left unaddressed, the system would absorb or eliminate the anomaly in the only way it knew how, by reframing it as a problem to be solved. And the cost of that solution would not be paid by him alone. She felt the shift in atmosphere before he did. Spaces that had once felt neutral grew charged with scrutiny. Security became more visible. Interactions with his associates acquired a new tension, a carefulness that bordered on assessment. The city itself seemed to watch them differently, not as two individuals, but as a configuration that did not fit. She understood what was happening because she had lived under similar dynamics all her life, only without the illusion of protection. She was being converted into a symbol. In some narratives, she was temptation. In others, manipulation. In still others, proof that even the most disciplined figures could be compromised by personal attachment. None of these interpretations acknowledged her as a subject. She was an object within a story that others were already writing. For him, this was intolerable. Not because it threatened his status, but because it confirmed the very reality she had been trying to show him, that in his world, human beings were never primary. They were always secondary to structure, always subsumed under the logic of preservation and profit. Their relationship could no longer exist in the shadows. And in the light, it was no longer safe. The conflict between them deepened, not in the form of argument, but in the form of mutual recognition that what they had discovered in each other could not be sustained within the world that surrounded them. She could not accept a reality in which her existence was constantly recalculated according to market value. He could not retreat into a belief in untainted ideals when he knew how deeply those ideals were compromised by the mechanisms that sustained them. They were no longer negotiating intimacy. They were negotiating reality. For her, the moral weight of his world became unbearable. She could not reconcile the tenderness she experienced in his presence with the knowledge that his wealth had been built on systems that had stripped her and countless others of security. To love him meant, in some sense, to legitimize the very forces that had broken her life into transactions. For him, the presence of her suffering within the framework of his power created a fracture he could not repair with capital. He could not buy absolution. He could not restructure his empire without destroying the foundations that made it possible. He was forced to confront the possibility that his life's work, however efficient, was incompatible with the kind of world in which someone like her could exist without being reduced to function. The illusion they had briefly inhabited, that they could exist together outside the logic of exchange, collapsed under the weight of exposure. What remained was not bitterness, but a raw understanding that their connection had become a liability in a system that did not tolerate deviation. Externally, the pressure intensified. Advisors grew more insistent. Media narratives sharpened. His decisions were scrutinized not only for their financial impact, but for what they revealed about his priorities. The question circulating around him was no longer whether he was powerful. It was whether he was still reliable. She was no longer invisible. Every movement was contextualized, every association interpreted. The safety she had momentarily felt began to erode, replaced by a more insidious vulnerability. Not the vulnerability of poverty, but the vulnerability of being a focal point within structures that could not afford unpredictability. Their love, if it could be called that, had become a strategic risk. For her, the realization was devastating. The one place where she had believed she could exist without being priced was now the very site of her most dangerous exposure. For him, the cost was equally severe. To protect her would mean destabilizing the systems he had spent his life maintaining. To abandon her would mean confirming that those systems were all that truly mattered. Neither of them yet knew which loss would be greater. But both understood that what they had uncovered was no longer an illusion that could be sustained. The world they had briefly touched, a world where presence was not a commodity, was incompatible with the reality that surrounded them. And in a universe governed by capital, illusion was never free. It always demanded payment. What they were only beginning to grasp was how high that price would be. The break did not arrive with violence. It arrived with clarity. What had once felt like tension, like pressure accumulating beneath the surface, finally crystallized into something neither of them could ignore. The illusion that proximity could be sustained without consequence dissolved under the weight of recognition. The structures around them had revealed their true nature, and in that exposure, the terms of their connection could no longer remain undefined. For him, the collapse was internal before it was visible. He had believed for a long time that his wealth was neutral. That capital, in its purest form, was simply a mechanism for creating possibility. He had told himself that what mattered was how power was used, not that it existed. Yet through her, he began to see the distortion in that belief. He recognized that what he had been seeking in her was not companionship, not even connection, but something far more elusive. A confirmation that he was still capable of something real in a world he had learned to treat as a series of abstractions. He had not tried to purchase her in the conventional sense. He had tried to purchase himself. Every access he had granted her, every boundary he had removed, had been part of an unspoken attempt to escape the hollowness of his own position. He had wanted to prove that within the architecture of his empire, there was still space for authenticity, that something untouched by transaction could exist alongside unlimited capital. But what he slowly understood was that his very methods of offering possibility were themselves expressions of the system he could not step outside. He had not liberated her from the logic of exchange. He had simply elevated it. For her, the realization was equally stark. She had entered his world with caution, aware of the danger of dependence, yet unable to deny the relief that came from stepping outside the brutal arithmetic of survival. For the first time in her life, tomorrow had not been a threat. Choices had not been dictated by necessity. She had been allowed to exist without being immediately priced. But that freedom had never been unconditional. She saw now that every advantage she had been given had come wrapped in the language of his reality. Even when he had not demanded anything, the structure itself had demanded that she be translated into value, not for him personally, but for the world he inhabited. Her presence had been absorbed into networks that did not understand people except as variables. She had been mapped, evaluated, contextualized. She had become a symbol, a risk, a weakness. She understood then that money could remove immediate suffering, but it could not grant sovereignty. It could change her circumstances, but it could not give her ownership of herself within a system that insisted on turning everything into exchange. To remain in his world meant accepting that her identity would always be subject to forces she could neither see nor control. That even love, in that environment, would be processed through structures that measured its worth in impact and liability. What they faced was not a misunderstanding. It was an incompatibility of realities. For him, to continue meant confronting the truth that what he had built could not coexist with what he had begun to feel. His empire required distance, predictability, insulation from vulnerability. His connection to her required the opposite. It demanded exposure, uncertainty, a willingness to accept that not everything could be optimized or secured. For her, to stay meant sacrificing the one thing she had fought her entire life to protect, the right to define herself outside the logic of utility. She could not allow her existence to be subsumed into a narrative where her value was determined by what she represented to powerful systems. Even if those systems offered comfort, safety, and a future that no longer felt precarious, they demanded a price she was no longer willing to pay. The choice between them became unavoidable. Not because of external pressure, though that pressure remained constant and unrelenting. Not because of fear of scandal or consequence, though both of them were aware of how quickly the world around them could turn. The choice emerged from something more fundamental, the recognition that continuing would require one of them to abandon a core truth. For him, that truth was the belief that power could be wielded without corrupting what it touched. For her, it was the belief that survival without self-possession was merely another form of captivity. They did not approach the moment as lovers clinging to illusion. They approached it as two people who had seen too much to pretend that feeling alone could override structure. The break, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no spectacle, no public fracture. It occurred in the quiet understanding that what they had become to each other could not be sustained within the terms that had made it possible. The connection that had once felt like escape now revealed itself as a contradiction. She understood that if she remained, she would be living inside a world that would never stop converting her into something legible to power. She would be protected, but not autonomous, valued, but never free of being measured. He understood that if he held on, he would be forcing her into a system that could never truly accept her as anything other than an asset. And in doing so, he would be confirming the very emptiness he had been trying to escape. He would be proving that even his most intimate attachments were ultimately subject to the same calculus that governed everything else in his life. Their separation was not an act of rejection. It was an act of precision. She chose uncertainty over containment. She chose the risk of returning to a world that had never been kind to her over the comfort of a world that could never fully recognize her. It was not courage in the romantic sense. It was coherence, a refusal to allow her identity to be rewritten by forces she did not consent to serve. He chose loss over possession. For the first time in his life, he confronted something that could not be negotiated, acquired, or replaced. He could not compensate for what was leaving him. There was no equivalent, no substitute. What he experienced was not merely separation, but the collapse of a belief he had carried for decades, that anything of value could be secured. The rupture exposed the limits of his power. He had known how to navigate markets, politics, and influence. He had never known how to accept absence. What he lost in her was not simply a person, but the possibility that his world could contain something uncommodified. With her departure, that possibility vanished. For her, the departure was not clean. She did not leave with triumph or relief. She left with the weight of knowing that what she was giving up was real. The safety, the access, the version of the future that had briefly seemed attainable. But she also left with something she had never been able to claim before, the knowledge that her life was no longer defined by what others were willing to pay for it. The city did not change for either of them. Capital continued to flow. Systems remained intact. The machinery that had shaped both their lives resumed its operation without pause. The world did not register their loss. It did not mark the end of their connection as anything other than a minor fluctuation in an otherwise stable order. But within them, the break was irreversible. For him, every decision that followed was haunted by the recognition that what he had believed to be absolute was not. He could still command immense power, still influence outcomes on a global scale. But he could no longer believe that this power was sufficient. He had encountered something that lay beyond its reach, and in losing it, he had learned the cost of a life built entirely on control. For her, every step back into uncertainty carried both fear and affirmation. The world she returned to was no gentler than the one she had left, but it was hers. She would have to navigate it without the shelter of his resources, without the protection of his systems. Yet she would do so as someone who had chosen herself over containment. Their story did not end in reconciliation. It ended in integrity. What they had shared was not erased by the break. It remained as a fracture in both their lives, a reminder of what had been possible and what had proven incompatible. The romantic line that had once drawn them together did not dissolve into sentimentality. It hardened into something more severe, a record of a choice made not for comfort, but for coherence. They had not failed each other. They had refused to turn their connection into another form of transaction. In a world where everything demanded a price, they had chosen to walk away rather than allow what they had discovered to be converted into yet another asset. The deal was not broken out of bitterness. It was broken because some things, once recognized as real, could not be bought. And for both of them, that realization would shape everything that followed. The world did not pause when they separated. Markets opened on schedule. Contracts were executed. Buildings continued to rise where neighborhoods had once stood. The machinery that had shaped both of their lives did not acknowledge loss, because loss was not a variable it was designed to register. What had ended between them was invisible to systems that recognized only movement, only growth, only the conversion of time into value. Yet for both of them, nothing remained the same. She returned to a life that did not soften to receive her. The streets were still indifferent. Opportunity was still conditional. Safety was still something to be negotiated rather than assumed. The relief she had briefly known, the absence of fear about tomorrow, the ability to make choices without calculating cost, was gone. What remained was uncertainty, once again familiar and relentless. But she did not return unchanged. The city did not recognize the difference, but she carried it in the way she moved, in the way she evaluated space, in the way she inhabited her own body. She no longer measured herself solely in terms of endurance. She no longer understood survival as the highest possible achievement. Having stepped outside the structure that had once defined her entirely, even briefly, she could not forget what that separation had revealed. She had seen what it meant to exist, without being immediately converted into utility. She had tasted a version of herself that was not contingent on what others were willing to purchase. That knowledge could not be unlearned. It did not make her safer. It did not make her life easier, but it altered the internal terms by which she would now engage with the world. Where once she had accepted transactions as the only possible form of relation, she now recognized their limits. She could still navigate them. She had no illusions about what the world required of her, but she would no longer allow them to define the totality of her identity. She had discovered a boundary inside herself that no longer dissolved under pressure. That boundary did not protect her from hardship. It protected her from erasure. There were nights when she felt the weight of what she had relinquished. The ease, the certainty, the version of the future that had briefly seemed accessible. There were moments when the cost of her decision pressed against her chest with a sharpness that threatened to undo her resolve. But even in those moments, she did not regret the choice itself. She understood that what she had refused was not comfort, but containment. She would walk forward without guarantees, without shelter from volatility, without the insulation of his world. But she would do so as someone who belonged to herself. For the first time in her life, that ownership was not theoretical. It was lived. The future did not appear to her as promise. It appeared as terrain, uneven, dangerous, unforgiving. Yet within that uncertainty, there was something she had never known before, the possibility of meaning not dictated by necessity. She did not romanticize struggle. She had endured too much to pretend that hardship ennobled. But she no longer accepted that survival alone was enough. If she was to continue, it would not be merely to remain alive. It would be to remain intact. Elsewhere, in a world that still bent around his influence, he confronted a different aftermath. His empire did not collapse in her absence. Investments continued to mature. Projects advanced. The systems he commanded remained obedient, efficient, unyielding. From the outside, nothing in his life suggested disruption. He still possessed everything he had always possessed: authority, access, security, the ability to reshape environments with a decision. And yet, for the first time, those possessions no longer functioned as proof of anything. He discovered that wealth, which had once seemed synonymous with mastery, now felt strangely insufficient, not because it had diminished, but because its limits had been exposed. He had encountered something that could not be stabilized, compensated for, or replaced. The loss he carried did not respond to the logic that had governed his entire existence. He could not buy what had left him. This realization did not manifest as despair. It manifested as a quiet disorientation, a sense that the internal coordinates by which he had navigated the world were no longer reliable. He had believed that control was the highest form of agency, that to direct outcomes was to live meaningfully. Now he confronted the possibility that agency without vulnerability was hollow. He had not lost power. He had lost the illusion that power was sufficient. In the days and weeks that followed, he found himself scrutinizing the structures he had once accepted without question. The systems that redistributed resources, displaced communities, abstracted human consequence into economic indicators. These mechanisms had always been visible to him in a technical sense, but now they carried a different weight. He could no longer treat them as morally neutral simply because they were effective. He saw, in retrospect, how thoroughly his world had been constructed to avoid direct encounter with the lives it shaped. He did not become an idealist. He did not imagine that the machinery he commanded could be dismantled without catastrophe. He understood too well how deeply entrenched it was, how many depended on its continuity, however flawed. But he could no longer believe in its innocence. The presence of her history within his life had altered his perception permanently. Where once he had seen efficiency, he now saw cost. Where once he had seen order, he now saw exclusion. He could not undo the past, could not retroactively transform the foundations of his empire into something untainted. But he could no longer inhabit it with the same unexamined certainty. He began to recognize the distinction between dominance and meaning. His world had taught him to equate success with expansion, accumulation, influence. Yet what he had lost had nothing to do with any of those metrics. It had been something fragile, unquantifiable, resistant to integration. In losing it, he had learned that the most significant elements of human experience existed precisely outside the structures designed to contain them. The memory of her did not soften with time. It did not become nostalgia. It did not resolve into a lesson neatly packaged. It remained as a presence that haunted his decisions not with regret, but with a question he could not dismiss. What was the point of commanding a world in which the most vital forms of connection could not survive? He did not seek to find her again. Not because he did not want to, but because he understood that to re-enter her life under the same conditions would be to repeat the very pattern they had both refused. To approach her now with the resources of his world would be to reassert the imbalance that had made their separation necessary. He would not turn what they had shared into another expression of his reach. If there was to be any meaning in what had occurred between them, it would have to remain unowned. The distance between them did not signify erasure. Their lives continued along divergent trajectories, shaped by forces that neither could fully escape. Yet each of them carried within their separate realities the imprint of what they had discovered together, a recognition that had altered the internal logic by which they engaged with the world. For her, the recognition was that identity could not be granted by circumstance, only claimed. That even in a world structured to convert existence into commodity, it was possible, at great cost, to refuse reduction. For him, the recognition was that power, however vast, could not substitute for authenticity. That to live entirely within systems of control was to risk becoming estranged from what made life more than a sequence of outcomes. Their story did not resolve into reunion. It did not offer redemption through sacrifice or transformation through love. What it offered was something more austere, a demonstration that connection, when stripped of illusion, could become a site of ethical choice rather than escape. They had not saved each other. They had confronted each other. And in that confrontation, they had both been forced beyond the roles the world had assigned them. She was no longer only a figure shaped by necessity. He was no longer only a figure defined by command. They had glimpsed a version of themselves that could not be fully realized within the structures that surrounded them. That glimpse did not liberate them from those structures, but it prevented them from fully belonging to them again. In the end, what remained was not happiness. It was integrity, a form of coherence that did not promise comfort, but offered something rarer. The knowledge that they had not allowed what was real between them to be absorbed into the same economy that had consumed so much of their lives. In a world where everything demanded a price, they had learned the cost of refusing to be priced. Not as a gesture of defiance, as a way of remaining human. Their lives continued, separate, imperfect, unresolved. But within each of them, something endured that could not be translated into value. A quiet certainty that the most radical act in a universe governed by transaction was to choose not to be owned. And in that choice, they had found not a fairy tale, not a triumph, but something more difficult and more honest. A future that belonged to them alone, even when it offered no guarantees. After the price, there was no illusion left. Only the ongoing work of living without surrender. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.